The rain in Chicago didn't wash things clean. It just turned the city into a blurred reflection of steel and neon. Julian Vance sat on the fourth floor of the Vance Greenwood Tower, staring at a spreadsheet that represented 3,000 jobs. As the chief financial officer, his world was composed of EBITDA, quarterly projections, and the cold, hard reality of trimming the fat. Julian was 38, but his eyes looked 50. He lived in a glass box in the sky, ate at restaurants where the portions were small and the checks were large, and slept 4 hours a night. His heart, once full of ambition, now felt like a well-oiled machine that had forgotten its purpose. "The merger is finalized, Julian," his assistant Sarah said over the intercom. "You need to sign the severance packages for the Ohio branch." Julian sighed, the sound lost in the hum of the air conditioning. He signed. He always signed. But that evening, the weight became physical. A sharp pain bloomed behind his eyes. He didn't go home to his empty penthouse. Instead, he grabbed a duffel bag from his office closet and headed for the parking garage. He needed to disappear. He needed the silence of his private retreat, a sprawling, modern lake house on the edge of Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. The drive was 2 hours of solitude, as the skyscrapers gave way to suburban sprawls and finally to the dark, skeletal trees of the Wisconsin lakeside. Julian felt his grip on the steering wheel loosen. He reached the gated driveway of his property at 11:30 p.m. The house was a masterpiece of glass and cedar, perched on a cliff overlooking the black water. It was a place of peace, or so he thought. As his headlights swept across the porch, he saw something that shouldn't be there. A pile of rags, a bundle of trash. Then, the bundle moved. Julian killed the engine. His pulse quickened, not with fear, but with a defensive instinct. This was private property. He stepped out of his SUV, the cold October air biting at his neck. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice sharp with the authority of a man used to being obeyed. The bundle stirred. A woman sat up, huddled against the heavy oak door. She was wrapped in a thin, oversized army jacket, her hair a matted blonde mess. But it was what she held against her chest that stopped Julian in his tracks. A child. A small, shivering infant wrapped in a fleece blanket that had seen better days. "I'm sorry," the woman whispered. Her voice was cracked, barely audible over the wind. The gate was open. "I just needed to get out of the wind. He's coughing. Please." Julian looked at her. She wasn't a threat in the corporate sense. She was a ghost. Her skin was pale, her eyes sunken. She looked like she hadn't slept in the same decade he had. "This is private property," Julian said, though the edge was gone from his voice. "The nearest town is 5 miles back. How did you get here?" "We walked," she said. "We've been walking since the bus dropped us at the station. I saw the lights of the porch. I thought maybe there was a shed. Somewhere dry." The baby let out a thin, wet cough. It was a sound of pure misery. Julian looked at his high-tech security system, the cameras that cost more than most people's cars, and then back at the shivering woman. The logic of his world said to call the police. The logic of his soul, buried under years of spreadsheets, told him to open the door. The lock clicked. Julian stepped inside and held the door open. He didn't say a word. He just gestured to the warm, climate-controlled interior. The woman hesitated, her eyes darting around like a trapped animal. She stepped over the threshold, her boots leaving muddy, wet prints on the Italian marble floor. She looked out of place, a smudge of reality in his curated museum of a home. "Sit," Julian commanded, pointing to the oversized leather sofa. "I'll get some towels." He went to the linen closet, his mind racing. What am I doing? I don't know this woman. She could be anyone. But he remembered the look in her eyes. It wasn't the look of a con artist. It was the look of someone who had reached the absolute end of her rope. When he returned, she was sitting on the very edge of the leather, as if afraid she might stain it. She was rocking the baby, humming a low, tuneless song. "I'm Julian," he said, handing her a stack of thick white towels. "Clara," she replied, "and this is Leo." "You're freezing, Clara. I'm going to turn on the fireplace. There's a guest suite down the hall. You can use the shower. I'll find some food." "I can't pay you," she said, her voice trembling. I don't have anything. Julian looked at his reflection in the dark window. Neither do I, Clara. Neither do I. While Clara showered, Julian stood in his kitchen, a room he rarely used. He heated up some organic soup and found some bread. He felt a strange electricity in his veins. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about the bottom line. He was thinking about a human being. Clara emerged 20 minutes later. She was wearing a robe he had left for her damp hair pulled back. Without the dirt and the desperation, she looked young, maybe mid-20s, but her hands still shook as she took the bowl of soup. "Tell me the truth," Julian said, sitting across from her at the kitchen island. "How does a woman and a baby end up on a private road in the middle of a Wisconsin autumn?" Clara took a slow sip of the soup, the warmth seemingly bringing life back to her face. "My husband, he wasn't a good man, Julian. He was the kind of man who thought people were property. When I got pregnant with Leo, I realized I couldn't let him grow up in that house. I left with $300 and a diaper bag. We've been moving for 3 months, working odd jobs, staying in shelters. But the shelters in the city were full, and someone told me there was a church in the next town over that helped people. I took the wrong turn." She looked at her son, who was finally sleeping soundly in the laundry basket Julian had lined with blankets. "I'm not a vagrant," she added, a spark of pride in her eyes. "I have a degree in accounting. I lost my momentum. Once you fall through the cracks in this country, it's very hard to climb back out. The shadows are deep." Julian winced at the word, accounting. He spent his life managing millions, while this woman was drowning for lack of a few hundred. The next morning the sun rose over Lake Geneva, turning the water into a sheet of hammered silver. Julian woke up on his recliner, having given the guest room to Clara. He expected her to be gone, to have slipped out in the night with his silver or his laptop. Instead, he found her in the kitchen. She had cleaned the entire first floor. The mud was gone from the marble. The dishes from the previous night were washed and put away. She was standing by the window, holding Leo, watching the birds. "You didn't have to do that," Julian said, startled. "It's the only currency I have," she said. "Labor." Julian looked at his phone. He had 16 missed calls from Chicago. The merger was hitting a snag. The real world was screaming for his attention. He looked at Clara, then at the phone, and did something he had never done in his professional career. He turned the phone off. "You're not going to the church today," Julian said. "The baby is still congested. Stay here. I have plenty of room, and frankly, I could use the company of someone who isn't trying to sue me or hire me." Clara looked at him with a mixture of hope and suspicion. "Why are you doing this? Men like you? You don't usually see people like me." "Maybe I'm tired of seeing people like me," Julian admitted. The peace of the lake house was a fragile thing. For the next 2 days, Julian and Clara lived in a strange, quiet rhythm. Julian found himself teaching Clara how to use the high-end espresso machine, while she showed him how to properly soothe a teething infant. For the first time in a decade, the CFO of Vance Greenwood wasn't thinking about market volatility. He was thinking about the temperature of a bottle. However, the real world Julian had tried to lock outside the gates was not easily ignored. On the third afternoon, while Julian was on his laptop attempting to handle a minor crisis regarding a hostile takeover bid, he noticed a black sedan idling at the end of his long driveway. "Clara, are you expecting someone?" Julian asked, his voice low. Clara walked to the window. Leo balanced on her hip. The moment she saw the car, the color drained from her face. She stepped back into the shadows of the kitchen, her breathing becoming shallow and panicked. "It's him," she whispered. "That's Marcus's brother's car. I don't know how... The phone. I must have turned it on for a second at the bus station to check the map." Julian stood up, his corporate armor sliding back into place. He wasn't just a numbers guy. He was a man who had navigated boardroom brawls with billionaires. He knew a predator when he saw one. "Go to the upstairs bedroom," Julian commanded. "Lock the door. Do not come out until I tell you." Julian walked out onto the porch just as the sedan's door opened. A man stepped out. He wasn't a businessman. He was built like a brick wall, wearing a leather jacket and an expression of practiced intimidation. This was Marcus, Clara's husband. "Can I help you?" Julian asked, standing at the top of the stone steps, his hands in his pockets, radiating an aura of bored wealth. "You're holding my wife," Marcus said, his voice a gravelly threat. "I tracked her phone to this coordinate. Move aside, pal. This is a family matter." "Actually," Julian said, his voice cool and precise, "this is a trespassing matter. You are on private property. There are 17 high-definition cameras recording your face, your license plate, and the fact that you just threatened me." Marcus laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "You think your money makes you tough? That woman is my legal wife. She took my son. That's kidnapping." "In the state of Wisconsin," Julian countered, drawing on his legal knowledge from years of corporate litigation, "a mother moving to ensure the safety of her child is not kidnapping. However, entering a gated estate with the intent to harass is a felony. I have the sheriff on speed dial. He's a personal friend. We play golf on Sundays. Would you like to meet him?" It was a bluff. Julian hadn't played golf in years, but he delivered it with the stone-cold confidence of a man closing a billion-dollar deal. Marcus hesitated. He looked at the house, then at Julian's expensive SUV. He realized he wasn't dealing with a weakling, but with a man who had the resources to bury him in paperwork and police reports. "This isn't over," Marcus spat, pointing a finger. "She's a gutter rat. She'll steal from you and leave you bleeding. You'll see." He got back into the car and sprayed gravel as he peeled away. Julian didn't move until the sound of the engine faded into the distance. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a surge of adrenaline he hadn't felt in years. He felt alive. When Julian went upstairs, he found Clara huddled in the corner of the guest room, clutching Leo so tight the baby was whimpering. "He's gone," Julian said gently. Clara looked up, tears streaming down her face. "He won't stop. He thinks he owns us." "Julian, I have to leave. I'm putting you in danger. He's a dangerous man with dangerous friends." Julian sat on the edge of the bed. He looked at this woman who had nothing, yet was willing to walk back into the cold to protect a stranger who had shown her a little kindness. "I've spent my life protecting assets, Clara," Julian said. "Buildings, stocks, patents. It's all hollow. For the first time, I'm protecting something that actually matters. You aren't going anywhere, but we need to do this the right way." He picked up his phone and dialed a number he usually only used for high-level corporate scandals. "Arthur, it's Julian Vance. I need the best family law attorney in the Midwest." "No, it's not for me. I need a protective order, a temporary custody filing, and a private security detail sent to the Lake Geneva house within the hour. Price is not an issue." Clara stared at him. "Why? Why are you doing all this for me?" Julian looked at Leo, who had grabbed Julian's pinky finger with a tiny, fierce grip. "Because I can, Clara. And because for a long time, I forgot that the point of having power is to help those who don't." The next 48 hours were a whirlwind. Julian's lake house, once a sanctuary of silence, became a command center. 2 private security guards stood watch at the gates. A lawyer named Elena arrived with a mountain of paperwork. While Elena interviewed Clara about the history of abuse, a grueling process that left Clara drained and sobbing, Julian had to handle his own war. His CEO, a man named Sterling Greenwood, called him on a video line. "Julian, where the hell are you? The merger is leaking. The board is asking why the CFO is holed up in Wisconsin with a homeless woman. The tabloids are starting to sniff around, Julian. They're calling it a midlife breakdown." "It's not a breakdown, Sterling," Julian said, looking at the screen. "It's a breakthrough. I'm handling a situation. I'll be back when it's resolved." "If you aren't in Chicago by Monday, the board will vote for your resignation," Sterling warned. "Is some girl worth your career?" Julian looked through the glass door. He saw Clara in the kitchen, carefully making a grilled cheese sandwich, laughing for the first time as Leo made a mess with a bowl of peas. She looked like a person who was finally breathing. "Actually, Sterling," Julian said, "she is. I'll have my laptop open for the emergency session, but I'm staying here." He hung up. He felt a strange sense of lightness. He was risking a $2 million a year salary. But for the first time, he felt like he was winning. The modern fairy tale hit its darkest point on Friday night. A massive thunderstorm rolled over the lake, the wind howling through the trees. The power flickered and died, plunging the house into darkness. The backup generator groaned but failed to kick in. In the shadows, the security guards radioed in. "Sir, we have a breach. Someone cut the fence at the north perimeter. They knew the blind spots." Julian felt a cold chill. Marcus wasn't just a bully, he was desperate. "Clara, get into the panic room in the basement," Julian whispered, grabbing a heavy flashlight. "Julian, please, just let him take me," Clara cried, holding Leo. "I don't want you to get hurt." "Nobody is taking anyone," Julian said, his voice hard as granite. He led them to the hidden reinforced room behind the wine cellar. Just as he closed the heavy steel door, he heard the sound of glass shattering upstairs. Marcus was inside. Julian didn't hide. He knew the layout of his house better than anyone. He moved through the dark hallways, the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic thumping of the rain against the glass. He reached the kitchen and saw a shadow moving near the island. "I know you're in here, rich man," Marcus yelled, swinging a heavy crowbar. He smashed a $5,000 crystal vase. "Where is she? Where's my son?" Julian stepped into the light of his flashlight. "They're safe, and you're trapped." "Trapped? I'm going to kill you. Then I'm going to find them," Marcus snarled, lunging forward. But Julian wasn't a fighter. He was a strategist. He had already triggered the silent alarm, and he knew the local police were only 3 minutes away. He just had to keep Marcus talking. "You think she loves you?" Julian asked, dodging a swing. "She's terrified of you. That's not love, Marcus. That's a prison. And prisons are expensive to maintain." The flashing blue and red lights of the police cruisers reflected off the rain-slicked windows of the lake house. Within minutes of the confrontation, the local sheriff's deputies had Marcus pinned to the marble floor in handcuffs. He was screaming obscenities, promising a reckoning that would never come. Julian stood by the kitchen island, his chest heaving. He looked at the shattered crystal and the scuff marks on his floor, then at the officers leading Marcus away. The threat was physically gone, but the atmosphere remained heavy with the residue of violence. "Is he gone?" Clara's voice came from the basement stairs. She was pale, clutching Leo so tightly that the baby began to fuss. "He's gone, Clara," Julian said, his voice softening instantly. "He's going to jail for breaking and entering, assault, and violating the emergency order your lawyer filed this morning. He won't be coming back." Clara collapsed onto the bottom step, burying her face in Leo's blanket. Julian sat beside her, ignoring the cold stone. He didn't offer platitudes or corporate reassurance. He simply sat in the silence with her, providing the one thing she hadn't had in years, a safe space. Monday morning arrived with the cold clarity of a Wisconsin winter. Julian sat in his home office, the lake a gray expanse behind him. On his monitor, the faces of the Vance Greenwood Board of Directors stared at him through a high-definition video feed. "Julian," Sterling Greenwood began, his voice tight, "the tabloids have photos of police at your estate. There are rumors of a domestic dispute involving a woman of no fixed address. The stock took a 2-point dip this morning. We need a statement of resignation." Julian adjusted his tie, a habit from a life he was starting to feel detached from. "I won't be resigning, Sterling. In fact, I'm calling for an audit of the Ohio branch's severance funds." The board went silent. "I've spent the last few days looking at things from the outside," Julian continued. "I realized that the trimming we did last quarter wasn't just numbers. It was people. People like Clara. I'm proposing a social responsibility fund, backed by 5% of our executive bonuses, to provide housing and job training for families in crisis." "You've lost your mind," Sterling hissed. "You're a CFO, not a saint. I'm a man who found a baby shivering on his porch while he sat on a billion-dollar pile of gold," Julian shot back. "If the board wants my resignation, they can vote. But I'll take my shares, my reputation, and the evidence of our predatory lending practices to the Wall Street Journal on my way out." It was a stalemate. For the first time, Julian used his power not to build a tower, but to build a bridge. The board didn't fire him. They couldn't afford the scandal, but they granted him a sabbatical. Julian didn't care. He had more important work to do. He spent the next month transforming the guest wing of the lake house into a permanent suite. He hired a private tutor for Clara, helping her refresh her accounting skills so she could sit for her CPA exam. It wasn't charity. It was an investment in a human being. "I found a job opening," Clara said one evening, showing him a listing for a junior auditor at a local firm in Lake Geneva. "It's entry level, but it's a start. I want to pay you back, Julian. For everything." Julian looked at her. The shadows under her eyes were gone. She looked radiant, her confidence returning like a flower after a long drought. "You don't owe me a dime, Clara. Watching you find your feet, that's been the highest ROI I've ever seen." "ROI?" She laughed. "You really can't stop being a CFO, can you?" "Maybe not," Julian smiled. "But I'm learning to value things that don't appear on a balance sheet." The final test of their new reality came in December. Julian was invited to a prestigious charity gala in Chicago. Usually he went alone, or with a date arranged by his PR team. This time, he asked Clara. "I don't belong there," she whispered, looking at the invitation. "These are the people who look through me." "Then let's make them look at you," Julian replied. When they arrived at the ballroom, the whispers started immediately. Clara wore a simple, elegant dark green velvet dress. She carried herself with a quiet dignity that no amount of money could buy. Julian stayed by her side, not as a protector, but as a partner. Sterling Greenwood approached them, a glass of champagne in hand. "So, this is the woman who broke the great Julian Vance?" Clara looked Sterling in the eye, her voice steady. "He wasn't broken, Mr. Greenwood. He was just underutilized. It takes a lot of strength to see a person when everyone else just sees a problem." Sterling blinked, stunned by her poise. He walked away without a word. Julian leaned in and whispered, "I think you just won that merger." As the clock struck midnight and the gala wound down, Julian and Clara stood on the balcony overlooking the Chicago skyline. The city that used to feel like a cold machine now felt like a place of possibility. "I was so scared of this city," Clara admitted. "I thought it would swallow me and Leo whole. I thought there was no room for us here." "There's always room," Julian said, taking her hand. His skin was warm against the winter chill. "We just have to be the ones to open the doors." He turned to her, his expression more vulnerable than he had ever allowed it to be. "Clara, I started this because I felt guilty. But I'm staying because, for the first time in my life, I'm not lonely. You and Leo, you've filled a house that was just a building." Clara squeezed his hand. "You saved our lives, Julian. But I think we saved yours too." Under the glow of the city lights, the CFO and the woman who had once been a ghost shared a look of profound understanding. The modern fairy tale wasn't about magic. It was about the extraordinary power of a single choice to be kind. The victory at the gala was a psychological one, but the legal battle was far from over. Marcus, fueled by spite and backed by a low-level criminal lawyer, attempted one last desperate play. He filed for full custody of Leo, claiming that Julian's extravagant lifestyle and unregulated environment were a danger to the child. He even tried to paint Julian as a predator who had lured a vulnerable woman into his home. The court hearing in Lake Geneva was tense. Julian sat in the mahogany-paneled room, his face a mask of corporate steel. He watched as Marcus's lawyer tried to twist his kindness into something sinister. "Mr. Vance," the opposing counsel sneered, "is it not true that you provided luxury housing and financial support to a woman you barely knew? Is this not a case of undue influence?" Julian stood up, not waiting for his own lawyer to prompt him. "It is a case of humanity," Julian said, his voice echoing with authority. "In the world of finance, we call it an emergency intervention. When a company is failing due to external abuse, we provide capital to stabilize it. Why should we treat a human being with less care than a corporation?" The judge, a seasoned woman who had seen 1,000 bitter divorces, looked at Clara. She saw a woman who had regained her health, her dignity, and her voice. She looked at Julian, a man who had risked his career for a stranger. The ruling was swift. Marcus's parental rights were terminated due to a documented history of violence, and a permanent restraining order was issued. The elevator ride up to the executive floor of the Vance Greenwood Tower felt different today. Usually, Julian used the brushed metal reflection to check the knot of his tie and harden his expression into the mask of the Ice King. Today, he looked at his reflection and saw a man he finally recognized. He wasn't wearing his usual $5,000 charcoal suit. He wore a simple navy blazer and no tie. The boardroom smelled of expensive leather and stale ambition. Sterling Greenwood sat at the head of the table, flanked by 3 other board members, who looked like they had been carved out of the same cold marble as the building. "You're late, Julian," Sterling said, not looking up from his tablet. "But I suppose that's to be expected, given your extracurricular activities in the countryside." He slid a heavy, cream-colored envelope across the polished mahogany. "This is your graceful exit. It cites a prolonged battle with exhaustion, very trendy these days. It keeps the shareholders calm. Sign it, and your stock options vest immediately. You walk away with $40 million. Everyone wins." Julian didn't sit. He stood at the foot of the table, looking at the men he had spent a decade enriching. "You're right about one thing, Sterling. I am exhausted. But not for the reasons you think. I'm exhausted by the math of misery. I'm exhausted by looking at a spreadsheet and seeing numbers where I should see faces." Julian pulled out his own envelope. It wasn't cream-colored. It was a plain white office envelope, but it felt heavier than Sterling's bribe. "I'm not resigning for my health. I'm resigning to launch Vance Social Capital. My first order of business was selling my majority shares. I didn't sell them to a hedge fund. I sold them to a non-profit workers' trust. As of 9 o'clock this morning, you don't answer to me. You answer to the very people you were planning to lay off in the Ohio merger." The color drained from Sterling's face. You sabotaged the structure. You'll be broke in 2 years, Julian. You're throwing away a legacy for a homeless girl in a whim." "Maybe," Julian smiled, a genuine, relaxed expression that terrified the board. "But for the first time in 10 years, I'm going to go home, look in the mirror, and not hate the person looking back. You can keep the office, Sterling. I'm keeping my soul." The silence that followed was absolute. Julian turned and walked out. Every step on the plush carpet felt lighter. When he hit the lobby, the air of the city didn't feel like smog. It felt like oxygen. Winter in Lake Geneva was a season of harsh beauty. But inside the lake house, the atmosphere had shifted from cold museum to warm sanctuary. The transformation was gradual but profound. The sharp, glass and steel edges of the living room were now broken up by a large, colorful playmate. The kitchen, once a place for expensive catering, now constantly carried the scent of cinnamon and slow-cooked stews. Clara had thrived in a way that defied Julian's wildest expectations. She didn't just pass her CPA exam, she had the highest score in the district. She now sat in what used to be Julian's war room. But the monitors weren't displaying stock tickers. They were displaying blueprints for low-income housing and grant applications. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Julian watched her through the glass door. She was explaining a complex tax credit to a young mother over a Zoom call, her voice patient and authoritative. Leo, now crawling with terrifying speed, was busy trying to help Julian by stacking wooden blocks against his leg. When she finished the call, Clara walked over and leaned against the doorframe. "You're staring again," she teased. "Just admiring the view," Julian said. "The lake?" "No. The lead accountant," he replied. "Do you ever miss the quiet, Clara? Before I dragged you into the middle of a corporate war? The quiet I had before was the quiet of a grave, Julian," she said seriously, walking over to sit on the floor beside him. "I was a ghost. People walked through me. You gave me a voice. Do you ever miss it? The power? Being the man in the tower?" Julian picked up one of Leo's blocks. "I used to think power was about how many people you could tell what to do. I was wrong. Power is about how much weight you can take off someone else's shoulders. I've never felt more powerful than when I see you and Leo safe. That's the only growth that matters now." The town of Lake Geneva had always viewed Julian Vance as a distant, slightly eccentric billionaire. But on the anniversary of the night Clara arrived, that perception changed forever. Julian had organized a town hall meeting. He didn't hire a PR firm. He sent out handwritten invitations to the local shelter, the library, and the small businesses. When the day arrived, the community center was packed. Reporters from Milwaukee and Chicago were there, expecting an announcement of a new luxury development. Julian stepped onto the small wooden stage. He looked at Clara, who was sitting in the front row with Leo on her lap. She looked nervous. He had kept this part of the plan a secret even from her. "A year ago," Julian began, his voice steady, "I was a man who lived in a house worth $15 million, and I was completely alone. I thought that house was my fortress. I thought it was my reward for a life of hard work. But a year ago, a woman and a child showed me that a fortress is just a fancy way of saying a prison." He paused, the room holding its breath. "Effective immediately. I am legally transferring the deed of the Lake Geneva estate to the Vance Clara Foundation. It will no longer be my residence. It will be converted into a multi-stage transition center. The ground floor will be a daycare and job training center. The upper floors will provide 18 months of secure, high-quality housing for families fleeing domestic abuse. We aren't just giving them a bed. We're giving them the tools to never need a shelter again." A gasp rippled through the room. A $15 million property, a landmark of the lake, given away? Clara's eyes filled with tears. She knew how much that house meant to him. It was the only place he felt he could breathe. She looked up at him, and he gave her a small, private nod. He was telling her that he didn't need the walls anymore because he had found a home in her heart. To truly reach the depth and length required for a cinematic YouTube drama, we need to expand the modern fairy tale, ending into a series of vivid, emotionally charged scenes that explore the aftermath, the internal growth, and the legacy of Julian's choice. Here is the expanded final section of the script. The transition from the sprawling glass palace to the modest 3-bedroom farmhouse on the outskirts of Lake Geneva was not merely a change of address, it was a purification. The permits for the Lighthouse Center had been a bureaucratic nightmare. Sterling Greenwood's allies on the city council had tried to block the zoning, claiming a shelter would lower property values. But Julian had fought them not with bribes, but with the same cold, analytical precision he once used to take over companies. He showed the council the data. The center would create jobs, provide childcare, and reduce the burden on local emergency services. He won. On the day the moving trucks arrived, Julian didn't feel the sting of loss. As he carried a box of Leo's toys into the farmhouse, a building with creaky wooden floors and a kitchen that smelled of old cedar, he felt a profound sense of lightness. The logistical nightmare of downsizing was, for Julian and Clara, the ultimate promotion. They were no longer curators of a museum, they were builders of a life. On the exact anniversary of the night the world changed, the weather in Wisconsin seemed determined to remind them of where they started. The sky was a bruised charcoal gray, and a biting wind whipped off the lake, carrying the scent of impending snow. Julian and Clara walked down to the public pier. The very spot where Julian used to stand alone, staring at the water and wondering why his millions felt like zero. Today, he wasn't alone. Leo, now a sturdy toddler in a bright red puffer jacket, was wobbling ahead of them. His tiny boots crunched on the frost-covered planks, and he let out a squeal of delight every time a seagull dipped near the water. "Look at him," Clara whispered, pulling her coat tighter and leaning her head against Julian's shoulder. "A year ago, he was a shadow. He was coughing so hard I thought his heart would stop. He was shaking in a thin, dirty blanket. Now, look at him. He thinks he owns the world." Julian reached down and took Clara's hand. His grip was warm, a stark contrast to the freezing air. "He does," Julian said softly. "He owns my world, at least. Everything I do now is so that he never has to know what the back of a bus station looks like." They stopped at the end of the pier. From this vantage point, they could see the old lake house. It no longer looked like a cold, untouchable fortress. The Vance Clara Lighthouse Center was glowing. Warm, yellow light spilled from every window. You could see the silhouettes of people inside. Mothers finally sleeping in peace, children playing in the new library, and volunteers preparing for the next day's training sessions. "You gave up everything, Julian," Clara said, her voice trembling with the weight of the realization. "The skyscraper in Chicago, the title of CFO, the palace on the hill. You gave it all to people who can never pay you back, people who don't even know your name." Julian turned to face her, his eyes bright with a clarity he had never possessed in the boardroom. He reached into the pocket of his wool coat and pulled out a small velvet box. When he opened it, it wasn't the kind of ring a billionaire buys to show off. There was no diamond the size of a grape. Instead, it was a simple, elegant band made of recycled gold. hammered by a local artisan into a texture that looked like the surface of the lake. "I didn't give up anything, Clara," Julian said, his voice dropping to a low, steady rumble as he knelt on the cold wood of the pier. The frost bit into his knee, but he didn't care. "I traded a life of shadows for a life of light. I traded a title that meant nothing for a family that means everything. I spent my whole life thinking I was the one who was supposed to save things. Companies, assets, stocks. But I didn't save you that night. You saved me. You woke me up from a sleep that would have killed me." He held the ring up toward her, the gold catching the dim afternoon light. "Clara, will you marry a man who has a lot less money than he used to, but has finally discovered what wealth actually is? Will you build the rest of this story with me? Not because I rescued you, but because we are better together than we could ever be apart?" Clara didn't need to think. She didn't need to weigh the pros and cons or look at a balance sheet. She knelt down on the pier with him, her laughter mixing with the tears that were already freezing on her cheeks. "Yes," she sobbed, throwing her arms around his neck. 1,000 times, yes. As they held each other, Leo let out a joyful, piercing shout at a passing bird, his small voice carrying over the sound of the waves. The CFO who had once been a machine was now a man of flesh, blood, and purpose. The homeless mother who had once been a ghost was now a pillar of her community. As the sun set behind the gray clouds, casting a final golden glow over Lake Geneva, the world saw the truth of the modern fairy tale. It wasn't about magic wands or glass slippers. It was about the shocking power of a single choice. The choice to see the humanity in a stranger and the courage to give everything away for the only thing that remains when the buildings fall: love.